They dragged her in chains, but a silent rancher changed her fate. The sun was just beginning to rise over the dry, dusty fields of the small town, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The morning air was cool but carried a tension that made it hard for anyone to breathe freely. In the center of town, near the old wooden bridge, a group of people had gathered. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, fear, and something darker, indifference. They had seen many things in their lives, but what was happening today would be difficult to forget. A young woman was being dragged along the road. Her hands were bound, and heavy chains rattled with every step she tried to take. Her feet scraped against the dirt, leaving small marks that told a story of struggle and helplessness. She did not cry out. She could not. Every scream had been silenced by the weight of her situation, but her eyes spoke everything she could not say. They were wide with fear and defiance, shining with a spark of life that refused to be completely crushed. The people watching did not intervene. Some turned away, pretending they did not see. Others whispered quietly among themselves, their words sharp and judgmental. The crowd was a mix of those who were too scared to act and those who believed it was not their business. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to be caught in trouble, even when it was clear that a wrong was being done. Among the onlookers, a man stood apart. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they had worked the land for decades. His skin was weathered from years under the sun, and his eyes were calm but alert, quietly observing everything. He did not move closer. He did not speak. His presence was almost invisible to the crowd, yet it carried a weight of its own. This was the rancher, a man who had always been known for his silence and solitude. People in the town often said he never wasted words, but when he acted, his actions carried power. Today, his attention was fixed on the young woman, and something deep within him stirred. The woman stumbled as the chains dug into her wrists. She fell to her knees, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The men dragging her said nothing, only grunting as they pulled her forward. She tried to push herself up, but the chains were too heavy, and her strength was fading. Her mind raced, thinking of the people she loved, the life she had before everything went wrong, and the hope that somewhere, someone, might come to help her. As she struggled, the rancher took a careful step closer. He stayed at the edge of the crowd, his eyes never leaving the scene. He had seen injustice before, but something about this young woman's courage, even in her fear, touched him. She was not just a victim. There was a fire in her that refused to die, and it reminded him of something he had once known long ago, a time when he too had felt powerless in the face of cruelty. The crowd grew silent as the procession moved through the center of town. Children peeked from behind fences, wide-eyed and confused. Some of the older townsfolk shook their heads in disapproval but still did nothing. The chains clanked loudly, echoing against the wooden buildings and raising the tension in the air. Every step the woman took seemed heavier than the last, and every step the rancher took toward the edge of action was measured and careful. No one had ever seen him act quickly in the face of danger, but today his mind worked like a storm. He studied the men dragging her, noting their movements, their patterns, and their weaknesses. He noticed the way they shifted the chains when she faltered, how their grip loosened for a brief moment when they were distracted. In that instant, the rancher realized that if he waited too long, it might be too late. The young woman needed someone to stand for her, someone strong enough to face what the crowd would not. The woman's breathing grew ragged. Her knees were bleeding from the rough ground, and her hands were raw where the chains had cut into her skin. Every step was agony, but she did not stop. She lifted her head, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of help, and for a fleeting moment, they met the ranchers. In that brief exchange, a silent understanding passed between them. He would help her, but he had to act carefully. If he made a wrong move, the situation could become even more dangerous. Time seemed to stretch as the procession continued toward the edge of town. The men dragging her began to argue among themselves, voices low but tense. The rancher noticed this and calculated the moment he would intervene. He did not rush. He waited for the perfect chance to act, knowing that his silence up until now had allowed him to observe and prepare. He could hear the young woman's heart beating rapidly, felt the rhythm of fear and determination that pulsed through her. Finally, a stumble gave the rancher the opportunity he had been waiting for. One of the men tripped over a rock, the chain swinging loosely for a split second. In that moment, the rancher moved.
He stepped forward, his presence suddenly undeniable.
The crowd gasped as he approached, but he did not speak. He simply stood tall, placing himself between the woman and her captors. His calm but commanding demeanor caused the men to pause, uncertainty flickering across their faces. The young woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She could not believe someone had finally stepped forward, someone strong enough to challenge the injustice she was enduring. The rancher gave no words, no promises. He simply extended a hand, an offer of protection, a silent vow that she was no longer alone. For a few tense moments, no one moved. The men dragging her were unsure how to react. The crowd watched, holding their breath, sensing that something significant was happening. In that silence, the power shifted. The rancher's quiet strength filled the space where words had failed. He did not need to speak. His actions were louder than any shout could be, louder than the clanging chains or the murmuring crowd. Slowly, carefully, the rancher began to maneuver the young woman away from danger. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and careful. He knew that a single misstep could put both of them at risk. The woman followed him cautiously, her trust in the silent man growing with each step. She still trembled, but her fear was now mixed with hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt that she might have a chance to escape her chains, both physical and metaphorical. The townspeople began to murmur among themselves. Some admired the courage of the rancher, others criticized him for intervening, but no one dared approach him. He was a figure of quiet authority, a man whose actions had earned respect without the need for words. His presence changed the energy in the crowd, shifting it from passive observation to anxious anticipation. As they reached the outskirts of town, the rancher finally allowed himself a small breath. The woman was still close, her hands raw, her body bruised, but she was moving. The first steps toward freedom had been taken, and though the journey ahead was uncertain, it was a journey she would no longer face alone. The rancher's eyes met hers once more, and in that silent glance he communicated what words could not. "You are safe now, and I will not let them take you again." The morning sun climbed higher, casting light on the dusty fields and the rough, uneven road. The clanking of chains faded behind them, replaced by the rhythm of determined footsteps. The woman's heart, which had been heavy with fear, began to feel a small lift of hope. She did not yet know what lay ahead, but she knew that with this silent rancher by her side, she had a chance to reclaim her life. And in the quiet strength of the rancher, the woman saw something she had not expected: compassion, courage, and an unwavering commitment to do what was right, even when no one else would. That moment marked the beginning of a journey that would change both of their lives forever, a journey that began not with words, but with action, and the courage to stand when others remained silent. The woman's legs ached with every step she took, but for the first time in days, she was moving forward on her own terms. The rancher walked beside her, silent as ever, yet his presence was more reassuring than words could ever be. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust as they followed the narrow path that led out of the outskirts of town. The morning sun had climbed higher now, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the road like protective arms, shielding them from curious eyes. Her hands were still sore from the chains, and every movement sent sharp pain shooting through her wrists. She flexed her fingers slowly, wincing as the memory of her captivity pressed against her like a heavy weight. I don't even know your name," she whispered, almost afraid to break the silence. The rancher's eyes flicked toward her, calm and steady. He did not answer right away. He had never been a man of many words. Instead, he slowed his pace just enough to allow her to catch up, giving her the space to walk beside him. He had learned long ago that actions often spoke louder than words, and today his actions would guide her more than any explanation could. The path led them through a small grove of trees, where the leaves rustled in the soft morning wind. Birds chirped overhead, their songs a gentle contrast to the harsh memories that still haunted the woman. She looked around, realizing for the first time that the world was still alive, that life moved on, even when darkness seemed all-encompassing. The rancher noticed her glances and allowed her a quiet moment to breathe. I don't know who I can trust, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Everyone else? Everyone just watched, or laughed, or looked away. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked quickly, not wanting to let them fall. The rancher slowed even more, letting her fall a few steps behind him, and then he turned his head slightly to meet her gaze. Though he did not speak, there was something in his eyes, a calm certainty that gave her a glimmer of hope. She wanted to ask more questions, to know if he had always been alone, if he had always been this silent, but the words stuck in her throat. The world had changed too quickly, and now, survival came first. They reached a small clearing where the grass was tall and soft beneath their feet. The rancher stopped and turned to her fully for the first time. He gestured toward the open space with a subtle nod, inviting her to sit while he assessed their surroundings. She sank onto the grass, exhaustion weighing her down, and allowed herself a deep breath. For the first time, she felt a moment of safety, as if the chains that had bound her were slowly melting away. The rancher's eyes never left the path they had traveled. He scanned the edges of the trees, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone was following. His instincts were sharp, honed over years of living and working on the land alone. He knew that people who did harm often returned, and he needed to ensure she was truly safe before allowing her to rest. As the woman sat on the grass, she reflected on what had brought her here. She had always tried to live a simple life, but circumstances beyond her control had brought her to this moment. She thought of the people who had hurt her, the people who had watched without helping, and the fear that had become a constant companion. Yet, in the midst of all this, one man had appeared. One man had stood up when no one else would, and though he said nothing, his actions spoke of courage, of care, and of quiet strength. After a moment, she looked up at him again. Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You don't even know me." The rancher did not answer immediately. He knelt on one knee, lowered to her level without reaching for her, and studied her face. There was no judgment there, only an understanding that came from someone who had seen too much pain and knew what it meant to help without expecting anything in return. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth, offering it to her. She took it, confused, and realized he wanted her to wipe the dirt and blood from her face. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The gesture was simple, yet it carried more meaning than words ever could. It said, "You are not alone. I will not let them harm you again." She could feel the weight of that promise, and though it was silent, it filled her with a sense of trust she had not felt in a long time. The rancher stood and moved a few steps towards the edge of the clearing. He motioned for her to follow, and together they walked cautiously. He led her to a small cabin he owned on the edge of his ranch. It was modest, with rough wooden walls and a tin roof, but it was sturdy and private, a place where they could be safe. Along the way, he kept his eyes on the surroundings, noting every sound and movement. The woman followed closely, noticing how he moved with careful confidence. Every step he took seemed deliberate, measured, as if the land itself guided him. When they reached the cabin, the rancher opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the air smelled of wood and leather, familiar and grounding. He offered her a chair, and she sank into it gratefully, finally allowing herself to relax. She could feel her body trembling from exhaustion and relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was not being dragged, not being chased, not being controlled. She was safe, at least for now. The rancher busied himself with simple tasks around the cabin. He fetched water, wiped down a small table, and even brought over some food. He did not speak much, but his actions communicated care and attention. She watched him quietly, realizing that words were not necessary between them. His presence alone was enough to assure her that she was no longer powerless. Over the next few hours, the woman began to recover physically, but her mind remained restless. She thought about the men who had dragged her, about the crowd that had watched, and about the chains that had cut into her skin. The memory of their cruelty lingered like a shadow, but it was fading slowly. The rancher had created a space where she could breathe, think, and even hope. As the sun moved higher in the sky, the woman finally spoke again. "I don't even know your name," she said softly. The rancher paused for a moment, considering. Then, in his quiet, deliberate way, he said, "Call me John." It was a simple name, but it carried weight. She repeated it quietly to herself. John. It felt grounding, familiar, like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. She realized that even though she had been through unimaginable fear, there was now someone in her life who would stand for her, silently but surely. John nodded at her, his expression unreadable, but she could sense a kind of reassurance in the way he moved. He was not a man who sought praise or recognition. He acted because it was right, and that quiet strength made her trust him more than anyone she had known. As the day passed, they began to settle into a routine. John tended to the land and the animals, while she cleaned herself up, removed the marks of her struggle, and began to regain a sense of normalcy. He offered guidance without intrusion, allowing her to make her own choices. She noticed small gestures of care, refilling her water, making sure she ate, checking the locks on the doors, but never forcing his presence on her. By evening, the woman realized something remarkable. She was no longer alone. She had a safe place to sleep, food to eat, and someone to protect her. But more importantly, she had hope. The chains that had bound her body were gone, and for the first time, she could imagine a life beyond fear. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. John stood near the edge of the ranch, surveying the land with quiet attentiveness. She watched him from the cabin, noticing the way he moved with care, the way his eyes scanned the horizon. He was a man of few words, but every action spoke of vigilance and protection. She felt a deep gratitude for him, though she knew it was not something he would ever seek to hear. Night fell, and the ranch was quiet, except for the sounds of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. The woman lay awake, reflecting on the events of the day. She had been dragged through fear, pain, and humiliation, yet here she was, alive and safe. A silent man had changed her fate without speaking much at all. She realized that sometimes courage did not come in the form of loud declarations or grand speeches. It came in quiet, steady actions that gave someone a chance to survive. As she drifted to sleep, she felt a small spark of determination grow within her. She would not let fear define her anymore. She would rebuild her life, step by step, with John's silent guidance and protection. And perhaps one day, she would be able to stand tall, not as someone who had been dragged in chains, but as someone who had survived and thrived because one person had chosen to act when the world stood still. The next morning, the ranch was quiet and still. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, bathing the fields in soft gold light. Birds sang in the trees, and the wind whispered through the tall grass. Yet, despite the peaceful appearance, danger still lingered nearby. The woman had found temporary safety, but the men who had dragged her were still out there, and she knew they might come looking for her again. John, the rancher, was already awake. He had been watching the horizon since before dawn, scanning for any signs of movement in the distance. He did not speak much, but his silence was purposeful. Every muscle in his body was alert, ready to act if needed. He had spent years working on his ranch alone, learning to read the land and anticipate danger. Today, that skill would be more important than ever. The woman watched him quietly from the cabin doorway. She was beginning to understand what kind of man John was. He did not rush or panic. He did not act recklessly. Everything he did was deliberate, measured, and calm. It was a strength she had never experienced before, and it made her feel safe in a way she had never known. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how much his help meant to her, but words seemed small compared to everything he had already done. John finally turned to her and nodded, a silent gesture that it was time to start planning. He had spent the night thinking about how to ensure her safety. Running alone or hiding would not be enough. They needed a strategy, a way to protect her from the men who had caused so much harm. John was not a man to rely on others for help, but he knew that careful planning and smart action could make all the difference. He led her outside and gestured for her to walk with him. Together they went to a part of the ranch that was slightly hidden from the main road, a place where trees grew thick and the ground sloped gently downward. John pointed to a small, concealed path that led deeper into the woods. "We will start here," he said softly. It was not much, but it was a start, a safe route that could lead them away from immediate danger. As they moved through the woods, the woman felt a mixture of fear and hope. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig made her heart race, but she also felt a quiet reassurance in John's steady presence beside her. He moved with careful precision, avoiding loose branches and keeping his eyes on their surroundings. She realized that his silence was not emptiness. It was focus, concentration, and protection. After a short while, they reached a small clearing near a stream. The water ran clear and cool, and the sound of it moving over the rocks was calming. John motioned for her to drink first, and she bent down, cupping the water in her hands. The simple act felt like a luxury, a reminder that life continued even in the midst of danger. He drank after her, never taking more than necessary, always mindful of her needs before his own. They rested there for a while, and John finally allowed her a few moments of conversation. She asked him questions, trying to understand him, trying to know the man who had stepped into her life so quietly yet so powerfully. "Why do you help me?" she asked again, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't know me."
"You didn't even have to do this." John looked at her, his expression calm but serious.
"Because no one should be treated that way," he said simply. "I've seen too much suffering in my life. If I can help someone now, I will." It was not a long speech, but it was enough. The sincerity in his voice combined with his actions told her everything she needed to know. He was a man of integrity, and he did not require recognition or reward for doing what was right. The woman felt a surge of gratitude, but also a sense of determination. She could not remain passive anymore. She had survived, and she had someone who believed in her. It was time to think about the future, about how to reclaim her life and ensure that the men who had harmed her could not do so again. John seemed to understand this unspoken thought. His eyes met hers, and in that silent moment, a plan began to form between them. They spent the next few hours moving carefully through the forest, following hidden paths and avoiding main roads. John taught her how to listen to the sounds of the land, to notice when something was out of place. He showed her how to move quietly, how to stay alert without panicking. The woman learned quickly, realizing that her survival depended on both courage and skill. With John's guidance, she began to feel capable, even strong. By late afternoon, they reached a small abandoned barn on John's property. It was old and weathered, but it provided cover and a place to rest. John checked the area carefully before allowing her inside. The barn was dusty and quiet, but it felt safe, and for the first time, she allowed herself to relax a little. She leaned against the wall, exhausted, but relieved. John stayed outside, keeping watch. He did not speak, but his presence was comforting. The woman realized that he was constantly thinking, planning, and protecting. He had been a silent witness to her suffering, but now he was an active participant in changing her fate. She felt a deep sense of respect for him, mixed with gratitude and a growing trust. As evening approached, John finally invited her to sit by a small fire he had started outside the barn. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and the soft crackling sound made the forest feel less intimidating. They shared a simple meal of bread and cheese, and for a moment it felt like a normal life, like things could be peaceful again. But the peace was fragile. John's eyes never stopped scanning the woods, alert for any sign of danger. He knew that the men who had dragged her would not give up easily. They might come looking for her, and if they did, they could be violent. The woman understood this, and it made her appreciate John's quiet strength even more. He was willing to face danger so that she could have a chance at life. That night, they took turns keeping watch. John did not speak much, but his actions were reassuring. He taught her how to notice sounds in the dark, how to detect movement, and how to remain calm under pressure. The woman felt her fear slowly transform into determination. She was learning to survive, not just to escape. With John's guidance, she began to believe that she could reclaim her life, step by step. Over the next few days, John and the woman continued to plan their next moves. They mapped out safe routes, identified places to hide if needed, and discussed how to avoid the men who had caused her harm. The woman learned to trust her instincts, to rely on her senses, and to act decisively when necessary. John's quiet mentorship gave her confidence, and she began to feel capable of facing challenges she never thought she could handle. Despite the danger, there were moments of quiet connection between them. The woman began to see John not just as a protector, but as someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. His silence was not cold or distant. It was deliberate and thoughtful. Every action, every glance, every small gesture conveyed a message of safety and support. She realized that she could trust him completely, and that trust became a foundation for her growing strength. One afternoon, as they moved through the forest, they encountered a small stream. John paused and gestured for her to drink first. She looked at him, noticing the careful way he moved, the way he watched her without intrusion. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes. He cared for her, not just as someone to protect, but as a person who deserved dignity, respect, and kindness. The woman felt a new determination rise within her. She had survived the chains, the fear, and the cruelty. She had found a silent ally who believed in her. Now it was time to take action, to reclaim her life fully. She would not be passive anymore. With John by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As night fell once again, they settled near the fire. John kept watch, his eyes scanning the darkness, while the woman reflected on everything that had happened. She had been dragged, silenced, and made to feel powerless. But now she had hope. She had safety. She had someone who would stand for her when others would not, and for the first time in a long time she believed that her life could change. The stars twinkled above them, and the forest was alive with the sounds of night. The woman felt a sense of peace, tempered by the knowledge that danger still existed. But she also felt strength, a quiet growing power that came from survival, courage, and trust. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but she was ready. With John's guidance and protection, she would face the men who had harmed her. She would reclaim her freedom, and she would no longer be defined by fear. And in that silent understanding, a bond formed between them, one built on trust, courage, and the knowledge that together they could overcome the darkness that had once threatened to destroy her. The night was quiet, but the air was heavy with anticipation. The woman sat by the small fire outside the barn, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea. She could hear the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The forest seemed calm, almost peaceful, yet both she and John knew that danger could return at any moment. The men who had dragged her in chains were still out there, and they would not stop until they found her. John stood a short distance away, his eyes scanning the darkened trees, his body tense yet steady. He had spent hours preparing for this moment. He had planned every step carefully, thinking of every possible scenario. He knew that it was not enough to hide. They needed to take action to ensure her freedom permanently. The woman watched him quietly, feeling a mixture of admiration and trust. John's silence was not emptiness. It was focus, strategy, and determination. She understood now that he had been planning her safety all along. The woman took a deep breath and looked at John.
I want to face this, she said quietly. I don't want to run anymore.
I want to make sure they can't hurt me again. John turned to her slowly, his expression calm but serious. He nodded slightly. Though he had always been a man of action rather than words, she could feel his agreement. He was ready to help her take control of her life, to face the threat together. The next morning, they set out from the barn. John had gathered supplies, ropes, water, and some food for the journey ahead. He had also scouted the area carefully, memorizing paths and noting places where they could hide if needed. The woman followed him closely, her heart pounding but her resolve strong. She had learned so much from him over the past days, how to move quietly, how to sense danger, and how to trust her instincts. Today, she would put all of it into action. As they moved through the forest, John pointed out signs of recent activity. Broken branches, footprints in the mud, and other small details indicated that the men were still nearby. He taught her how to recognize these signs, how to read the land, and how to anticipate danger before it arrived. Every lesson was vital, and she absorbed them all, knowing that her life depended on it. Hours passed and they reached a small clearing. John gestured for her to sit and wait while he moved ahead to check for safety. She watched him disappear among the trees, her pulse quickening. She knew that he was skilled, that he could handle himself, but a small part of her feared the unknown. She focused on her breathing, remembering everything he had taught her, and felt her courage grow. John returned after a few minutes, his expression calm but alert. He motioned for her to follow and led her to a hidden path that wound through the forest and eventually opened onto a wide open field. The men could not see them here. It was a perfect location to plan their next move. The woman looked at John, realizing that he had thought of everything. He had created a safe space for them to act, a place where they could finally take control of their situation. Over the next few days, they prepared carefully. John taught her how to move silently, how to anticipate the men's actions, and how to stay calm under pressure. They practiced different scenarios, imagining what might happen if the men tried to find her. The woman's confidence grew with every lesson. She realized that she was no longer the helpless person who had been dragged in chains. She had learned to survive, to act, and to protect herself. Finally, the day came when John decided it was time to confront the situation directly. They had gathered enough information to know where the men would be, and they had planned their approach carefully. The woman felt a mixture of fear and determination. She trusted John completely, and she knew that with his guidance, they could face the men safely. As they approached the area where the men were likely to be, John signaled for her to stay low and move quietly. The forest was dense, providing cover for their approach. The woman's heart raced, but she focused on her training. She moved carefully, following John's lead, aware of every sound and every movement around her. They reached a point where they could observe the men without being seen. The woman could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she watched the men, who were unsuspecting of their approach. John whispered instructions, guiding her through the plan they had created together. Every detail was precise, every action calculated. The woman felt a surge of confidence. She was no longer a victim. She was part of a strategy, and she had the power to change her fate. When the moment arrived, John moved swiftly and decisively. He used his knowledge of the terrain to approach the men from a direction they did not expect. The woman followed his lead, staying hidden but ready to act if necessary. The men were caught off guard. They had underestimated the woman and the quiet rancher who had stepped into her life. John's presence alone was commanding. The men hesitated, unsure how to react to his calm but powerful demeanor. The woman realized that fear could be faced, not just endured. She felt a surge of strength as she stepped forward, supporting John's actions. Together, they made it clear that the men would not harm her again. The power dynamic had shifted, and the men recognized it immediately. After the confrontation, the woman felt a mixture of relief and triumph. The danger was not gone entirely, but it had been neutralized, for now. She could finally breathe without the constant fear of being dragged or attacked. She looked at John, realizing the depth of his courage and the quiet determination that had changed her life. He had acted not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. In the days that followed, the woman and John returned to the safety of the ranch. She began to rebuild her life slowly, with his guidance and support. She learned to trust again, to find strength within herself, and to believe that she deserved safety and respect. John remained a silent presence, guiding her without pressure, allowing her to grow and regain her independence. The community began to notice the change in her. People who had once ignored her suffering now saw her strength, her resilience, and the quiet bond she shared with John. They could not fully understand the depth of what had happened, but they respected the courage it had taken for her to survive and for John to intervene. As time passed, the woman became more confident and self-reliant. She could walk through the town without fear, knowing that she had the skills and the strength to protect herself. John remained by her side, a steady presence, not as someone who controlled her, but as someone who had helped her reclaim her life. Their bond was unspoken but strong, built on trust, courage, and shared experience. One evening, as the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, the woman looked at John and spoke for the first time without fear. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." John nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face. "You did most of it yourself," he said. "I just helped." The woman realized that he was right. She had survived, she had learned, and she had grown stronger. John had provided guidance, protection, and courage, but it was her determination and resilience that had truly changed her fate. As the night settled in, the ranch was quiet and peaceful. The woman felt a sense of safety and hope that she had never experienced before. She knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. And she knew that John, the silent rancher who had changed her fate, would always be there as a guiding presence, a reminder that courage and kindness could alter even the darkest moments of life. In the days and months that followed, the woman flourished. She worked on the ranch, learned new skills, and built a life of independence and strength. She became a symbol of resilience in the community, an example of what could be achieved when someone refused to be defeated by fear. And through it all, John remained quietly by her side, never seeking attention, never asking for thanks, but always acting with courage and integrity. The woman often reflected on how her life had been transformed. She had been dragged in chains, silenced, and made to feel powerless. Yet because of one silent man's courage and wisdom, she had been given a second chance. She had been shown that hope could exist even in the darkest of times, and that one person's actions could change the course of another's life forever. And so her story became one of survival, courage, and the power of quiet action. She learned that true strength did not always come from loud voices or grand gestures, but from those who acted with integrity, who chose to stand when others remained silent, and who believed in the possibility of a better future. The woman's life had been changed, not just by escape, but by the compassion and courage of the silent rancher who had refused to let her be defeated. And in that bond, in that shared experience, they both discovered something rare and precious, a trust and connection that would guide them forward, through the challenges of life, and into a future full of hope and possibility.